Hello, my beautiful friends. I am Laurel Bleadon-Maffei with Illuminating Souls, welcoming you to this episode of Sleepy Bedtime Blessings, a podcast designed to help you rest, relax, and fall asleep, all while deepening in your connection with your beautiful team of angels who love you so. If this is your first time listening, welcome. I am an angelic practitioner, a spiritual teacher, and an encourager of souls. I know that's quite a mouthful. I have the blessing of giving myself my own job title, and once I started, I just couldn't stop. Hence the really long job title, but it's very descriptive and it delights me every time I say it. And if you're not quite sure what that means, it means that I am here to help inspire your soul. I do this through one-on-one angel sessions, soul mentoring, and a variety of classes designed to inspire your spirit. But every 6 weeks or so, I have a new class, always something different showing up. My classes are typically small in size, so you really get an opportunity to be loved and supported. And you can learn more at my website, illuminatingsouls.com, where you can also sign up for my daily inspiration email blast. And in other podcast-related news, I am happy to share with you that I have started posting episodes to YouTube. And my YouTube account is Laurel Bleadon-Maffei, and hopefully, fingers crossed, if you search for Sleepy Bedtime Blessings podcast in YouTube, you will see all of the episodes there. There isn't much video-wise other than a static image with the audiogram going across, but if it is easier for you to have YouTube playing in the background, I just want you to know that is now an option. And if you are a YouTube person and you find the podcast, please hit the subscribe button and like it so that YouTube knows that this is something good to be promoted. And if you are enjoying the podcast, I would be ever so grateful if you would leave a rating or a review in your favorite podcast app. But for now, the angels and I are here to bring to you beautiful waves of love to help you come into a good expanse of rest. I've created this podcast because I listen to a sleep podcast every night. And I love the genre, and so I was guided to add my voice to the voices that tell bedtime stories and lull you to sleep. And I do know that some of you listen to the podcast during your waking hours. So however you choose to listen, you have my love and support. So I invite you to take some nice deep breaths in and just release. Just letting go anything that came before this moment. As I record this, it is the early morning. The sun is just getting ready to rise, so I anticipate birds chirping soon, so if you hear them in the background, just a little extra nature sounds for you. But I am feeling the love pouring through already. I love this opportunity to come into the blanket fort, and share this love with you. And I'm just taking a deep breath with you. There is this very sweet angel card deck called the Original Angel Cards. They have dozens and dozens of these tiny little cards that have words on them with a little picture of an angel. And so I drew a card this morning for us, and the word on it is freedom. How is that for a sweet invitation? In this moment, you don't even need to know freedom from what or what that would mean. But as we take a deep breath in, I invite you to open to the invitation of divine freedom. So take a deep breath in, and I'm going to invite the angels in to be with us. They are already here, but I love the ritual of sharing them with you. So beautiful angels on high, I invite you to join us here. And I ask that you bring forward waves of love, waves of healing, and waves of light and service to each of our beloveds listening to this message. I ask that you bring forward waves of inspiration and goodness, helping to clear from us any old patterns of fear or worry that we no longer need to embody. And angels bring forward that beautiful sweetness of freedom, helping to bring forward liberation from old bonds that we no longer need to endure, and helping us to come into the brightness of this moment, the lightness of spirit that is here with us. So dear ones, just take some more nice deep breaths in and out and get comfortable in your body. If you are preparing for sleep, just snuggle on in and cozy on up, pulling up your blankets just so. Adjusting your pillows so that you are extra comfortable. And I'm going to invite the angels to bring forward some wisdom about freedom for us. So each of us on our life's journey, we stumble into multitudes of experiences, of beliefs. We have memories. We have social constructs. And sometimes we wind up embodying beliefs, fears, situations that are not even really ours, or that perhaps we have evolved from and we no longer need to inhabit these old lines of energy. And so as the angels bring forward this concept of freedom, you know, sometimes with freedom we think, oh, I want to have enough money, or I want to have so much money I can do whatever I want. And we think of freedom in very grandiose ways. But freedom is also found in everyday consciousness, the freedom to be who you are, the freedom to be you, authentically, beautifully, magically you. And so as the angels are with us, they invite you to breathe in the wisdom of divine freedom. Giving yourself permission to liberate yourself into the beauty of this moment. You know, I'm guided to share a turning point in my life, and I've shared this with you before, but I'm guided to share it again in the context of this exploration of freedom. So I grew up knowing I was a person, right? We're people, we're human beings. And that there was this thing called my soul that was mysterious, that was out there somewhere. And my belief was when I died, when I transitioned, I would somehow get reunited with this mythical, beautiful thing called my soul. And that's really what I believed. That's what my thought was. That somehow you get through life and then you get to go into this magical, beautiful, etheric awareness of self, or whatever we would call that. And I'd heard the adage before, you are a spiritual being having a human experience. You're not a human being with a soul, you are a soul having a human experience. I had heard that adage before. Yet when I went to the University of Santa Monica, that's where I went to get a degree in spiritual psychology. The very first night of class, they hand us these really big 3-inch 3-ring binders filled with information. And so they have us open to a certain page, and on this page is a list of agreements, tenets that we would agree to for the purposes of this program. And one of them is, I forget exactly how they phrased it, but you are a soul having a human experience. And as such, you are whole and complete. And you have all the resources you need to effectively deal with your situations. And so the program is built around this premise that we are whole and complete, that we are divine beings in human form. And this was a profound paradigm shift for me. And it's not something that I adopted right away. It takes a while to live into the wisdom of this and what it means to shift in this way. For me, how it played out was I had spent so much of my life identifying as my wounds and my flaws and my sad stories. And I think a lot of us do this. It's not that I had an exceptionally tragic life, but I really identified to others through my pain points. You know, and I would get together with friends. I'd be like, yeah, I have no money. Yeah, I have no money. I need to go back to Weight Watchers. Yeah, I need to do that too. And again, this is nothing about my friends. It was how I identified in the world was as my deeply human experiences. So within the first few months of being at USM, I started shifting how I contemplated my beingness. So what if I wasn't my sad story? What if I am this beautiful divine being having a human experience? What if I am whole and complete? What if I am filled with wisdom and light? What if I am functioning in a universe that loves me? What if God is with me? God is in me. What if there is beauty that is my truth? What then? And it provided the beginnings of such a profound freedom from the Earth Girl's perception of the world and my place in it. And the love came flooding in, and the compassion came flooding in for this sweet, tender experience that is life. It is now one of the foundational beliefs around which I have built my life, that we are all divine beings having human experiences. And as such, we are filled with such deep potential and wisdom and light. And so as we contemplate divine freedom, I share this with you. It is one of the things that I hold precious in my life's work, is to help you remember that you too are a beloved of this universe. That you are a divine being in human form, and there may be parts of you have forgotten your wholeness and your light, but it is here with you, for you, as you. So I invite you to take a deep breath in and breathe in the beautiful wholeness of all that you are. That your soul's essence is not something that lives in this far away, mythical, etheric space. It is here as your breath. It is here as your heartbeat. And the expansiveness of your soul, or the greater expanse of all that you are, as my guides call it. They don't like to use the word soul too often because they say it's too small. Josephus and the Wisdom Council call it the greater expanse of all that you are. You are magnificent. You are timeless, you are wise, you are magical, and you are beautiful. So take a deep breath in, breathing in the blessings of divine freedom, coming in to the magnificence of your soul, of your spirit, and of your beingness. The angels are with you, supporting you in this. And allow the light to come in and help you reconnect with divine source, opening to the light that you are, opening to the love that you are. You are a big, bright soul. And this world is better because you are here. And you are precious. And you are loved. And I am so grateful for this opportunity to remind you of this now. So you just keep breathing and letting the angels love you. And you go ahead and rest and drift off whenever you are ready. And while you rest, I'm going to share a story with you. And perhaps it would be more accurate to say I'm going to share stories with you, plural, because in this episode I want to share with you about my dad. So this episode is going to be published on what would be my dad's 101st birthday. My dad departed this earth in 2003, but he still dwells in my heart. He is a part of my life. And I find in this podcast I often talk about my mom, but I don't talk about my dad too much. And he was a wonderful guy, and I thought perhaps you would allow me the blessing of sharing him with you. I had been contemplating this as an episode, and then it really settled in for me through a conversation I had with someone this weekend. I attended a luncheon, and I'll share with you a little bit about that at the end if we have time. And I had a conversation with a really lovely woman I have come to know over the past few years. And we were talking about grief. And how grief is a club we're all going to join at some time. And the blessing of sharing stories about our loved ones. You know, not only about the grief of them, but who they were in life. And she had shared with me that she had really come to love Anderson Cooper's podcast about grief called Is That All There Is? And I love Anderson Cooper, and I have listened to the first 2 episodes so far. It's a wonderful podcast that I highly recommend. And I was just listening to the episode with Anderson and Stephen Colbert, and they were talking about the importance of sharing these stories, that sometimes we are the only ones who continue to have the memory, and how wonderful it is when we get to share these memories with each other. And over this past year or so, to my absolute delight and surprise, this podcast has become a place where I can share these stories with you. These little stories that are so sweet, that are part of my life. And I can tell them to you in a quiet, rambling way that will help put you to sleep, and perhaps infuse some more love and delight into your life. And also, my hope is at some point, decades from now, they will somehow be available to be stumbled upon by any future descendants of our family. I love to do genealogy, and any time I stumble across something about one of my ancestors, I get so excited. So who knows, maybe there will be a great or grand niece or nephew who will listen to these in 40 years and love getting to know a little bit more about my dad. He was a really good guy. You guys would have loved him. He would have loved this technology of a podcast. And he also would have likely cautioned me about oversharing and not being too emotional. So let me introduce you to my dad, Jack Bleadon. He was a good guy. I'm really blessed. I was a girl who had a really good father. I know not everybody gets to have a good father, but I had one. He grew up on the south side of Chicago. He was raised an Orthodox Jew. His father was a jeweler. He had a jewelry business with two of his uncles, so my grandfather's brothers, who would have been my father's uncles. And life was not easy. They were rather poor, and my grandfather passed away when my dad was 18. And then my dad enlisted to fight in World War II. He was a navigator in the Air Force. And probably like anyone who has been in a war, he had several close calls where it's surprising that he survived. And I think someone was watching over my dad for sure. So my dad became an electrical engineer. And my dad he was a quiet guy. You know, our family is pretty lively. I would say I come from a matriarchal family in a way. Like my mom and her sister definitely ran the show, and in a sweet way. I don't mean to make this sound heavy-handed. And we were a family that loved conversation. We always had something to say. And you kind of need to know when to jump in, right? It's not as if someone is going to pause the conversation and thoughtfully ask, what do you think? It's like you got to jump in. And my dad was not someone to jump in that way. He was a quiet, thoughtful man, and so he would often just sit and listen and observe. And it wouldn't be until much later in life that I would grow to appreciate that about him. I guess now would be a good time to also share with you that my dad was a Pisces. For any of you that know astrology and give it any sort of weightiness, my dad was truly a Pisces. He felt deeply. He would cry at commercials on the television. He felt deeply, but throughout the course of his life, he learned not to show it. He was brilliant. He was very service-minded. He was always serving on some committee or the Temple Brotherhood. He believed in service. And he was a kind person. He wasn't someone to raise his voice and yell. He was kind and he was generous. And so I thought I would just share some different snippets about my dad for you so you can get to know him as well. So I grew up with a younger sister and an older brother. I'm the middle child. And I figured out when I was fairly young that if I wanted time alone with my dad, all I had to do was ask him to take me to a museum on a weekend. Sometimes my sister didn't want to go and my brother wasn't interested. And so my father would take me to different museums, and Chicago has wonderful museums. The Museum of Science and Industry, the Field Museum, and the Chicago Historical Society. And so when I wanted my special alone time with my father, I would ask to go to a museum. And I remember driving into Chicago from Skokie, and this was before the days of knowing about seat belts and child restraints for cars, child safety. I grew up in the wild 60s. And so I remember I would lean forward and put, like my head over. I would be in the back seat, but I would kind of lean over the seats. And I would ask my dad questions. Because no matter what I asked him, he had an answer. And I loved this time alone with my dad. And I would think of questions. I was like, what can I ask him next? And I would ask a question, and then he would tell me the answer. And I thought that was genius. Like, I loved this. And I always looked forward to our time in the car as much as I enjoyed the museum. And then, of course, once we would get to the museum, we would wander around and my dad would explain things to me because he was a really smart guy. And we had this special time together that I love. I still love the memory of that. I just remember knowing that if I wanted time alone with my dad to ask to go to a museum, and my dad was always game, and then I would sit up from the back seat and look over the front seat and pepper my dad with questions. Listen, I don't know how he felt about that, but in my memory, he loved that time too. He always had an answer for whatever question I would pose. I don't even remember what I would ask him, but we would talk about whatever museum we were going to or what was happening in life. And so I have a lot of beautiful, warm memories about that. And it's interesting in seeing how my dad was with my cousin's children. So both of my cousins, each of them has two daughters, and my dad just loved them. Like, first of all, he loved my cousins and he loved their children. But the reason I'm bringing this up is my dad really loved children. You wouldn't have thought that. My dad seemed so stoic. But he just lit up around these kids. And then when the grandkids were born, he loved them too. And so I can only imagine that my dad really enjoyed me and my sister and my brother when we were younger, because I saw how he was with my cousins and my nieces and nephews. So I can only imagine how he enjoyed that time at the museums. Although, who knows, maybe he was like, oh no, she wants to go to the museum again. And my mom said, take her, Jack, it'll be good for her. I don't know. I don't really think that's what happened. In my mind, my dad was just as delighted by our time together. The other really sweet memory I have of my dad that my sister and I share is we shared a room until I was 16 years old. And when we were little girls, we were, I guess, afraid of the dark. I don't mean this in a really dark, scary way. I think more in just a regular kid way. We didn't like being alone in the dark. And so my dad started sleeping on the bedroom floor between our beds to help us go to sleep. And he wouldn't sleep there all night. He would get the Afghan. There was this black multicolored granny square Afghan that my mom had crocheted that became this talisman of comfort in my family. Like, each of us kids always wanted that Afghan. We fought over it. And so at night, when it was our bedtime, my dad would lay on the floor. There was a very thin pink carpet, so it was a very hard surface because it was hardwood floors at the time. We hadn't had carpeting yet, but there was a rug that was pink, and he would lay down on it and pull the Afghan over him. Perhaps he had a pillow. I don't remember the pillow part of it. And then we would tell stories to each other. So this bedtime story thread definitely has roots back to those times with my dad. And so he and my sister and I would take turn telling stories until we would drift off to sleep. And at some point, when my sister and I were asleep, my father would get up and go back downstairs where my mom was, and that's how for many, many nights my sister and I drifted off to sleep. And I love that memory. I wish everyone could have that kind of experience, because there was nothing that made me feel safer than going to sleep knowing my dad was right there, and hearing the mumbling of the stories and his voice and my sister's voice was so profoundly comforting, and I'm sure in some way helped plant the seed for my love of sleep podcasts and being here with you now. And whenever somebody would comment about, "Oh my God, Jack, how do you sleep on that hard floor?" he'd always say, "Oh, it's good for my back." He never made us feel that he was annoyed by it. He'd always say, "It's good for my back." And I don't know how long that went on for, but it went on for quite some time. And so I always felt really safe around my dad. He was my protector. And I love that so much of my childhood has these sweet memories of him answering questions, going to the museums, sleeping on our floor, and telling us a bedtime story. It's really precious, especially now that I talk to so many people in my line of work, and I know not everybody got to have those kinds of experiences. And so I share them with you now and share this love energy with you. And I feel the love of my dad here as well. He's a good man. I'm glad that you're getting to meet him. So some other things about my dad is, so I mentioned that I shared a room with my sister until I was 16 years old. And that's because for my 16th birthday, my dad finished our back porch to make it into a bedroom for me. God bless my dad. He worked full time, and yet on the weekends and evenings, he built out our back porch to be a bedroom for me. So at the back of the house was an enclosed porch. I think many homes had this feature. And so my dad figured out that if he divided the back porch into two, he could carve out a really tiny little bedroom for me. And it was really small, but it was mine. And if you think about the color palette of 1978, it had sort of brown, orange, shaggy carpeting, which I loved. And one of the cool things about it is it had its own air conditioner and its own baseboard heater, so I could climate control my own room. And so my dad did that. He built out a room for me. And what was really sweet was years later, when I moved to California, that became my dad's room. He set up his computer out there. And thank God for the advent of the personal computer, because when my dad retired, he fell in love with personal computing and the internet. So my dad had time with AOL and the internet and searches, and he loved that stuff. My dad would have loved having an iPhone or an iPad, but he passed away before they were created. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So my dad built out this wonderful room for me. And how did I reward him for that? Well, I'm embarrassed to say that I went into my bratty, eye-rolling, silent treatment phase of my adolescence. For as much as my dad hung the moon for me while I was growing up, I definitely hit a stage that embarrasses me to this day when I just wouldn't talk and I would roll my eyes and I had absolutely nothing to say. It's one of those times of life that I wish I could take back. I'd be like, okay, Dad, we need to do a do-over. And he was such a good guy. I was going to college at Columbia College in downtown Chicago. And as an electrical engineer, my dad worked at job sites at some of the landmark buildings in Chicago, including the John Hancock and Sears Tower. And so when he had to go downtown, he would offer to drive me into school so I didn't have to take the train, which was a real treat. And we would drive and I would say nothing. I'd be like, it's too early. I can't talk. And I cringed. Do you have any of these moments in your life when you were younger and you're like, ooh, that was cringeworthy, Laurel? I think, Dad, what I wouldn't give to be driving into the city with you again. And this time I would ask questions and talk. So I do have to claim my eye-rolling, silent adolescent period as well. But he hung in there. Good guy. He always hung in there with me for sure. So as we sort of progress along the timeline of life, my dad was very supportive of me moving to Los Angeles. As was my mom. I think it was really hard for both of them to see me go. But I think they understood that something was calling to me, which I give them credit for. I was 23 years old. And I decided I was moving to Los Angeles. I had gotten a job. I didn't know anyone there. And they let me go. Not that they could have stopped me, but they could have made it much harder on me. They were deeply supportive. And the interesting thing about my dad was he was stoic. So as I said, he wasn't a big talker unless he had room to talk. And so when I lived in LA, I would call and I would always talk to my mom. My mom was the talker, the conversationalist. You know, my dad picked up. He'd say, how are you? I'd say, I'm fine. He'd say, how's the weather? I'd say, it's great. And he said, okay, here's your mom. Or here's your mother. And then I would get on the phone with my mom and tell her everything. And then this happened. And then the other thing happened. And then my mom would relay that all to my dad. But I didn't directly tell my dad all of my stories. They were relayed through my mom. And my father called me so infrequently. You know, my mom always called me. But rarely did my father call me unless something was going on with my mom. So if I picked up the phone and I heard my dad, I'd be like, is Mom okay? Because usually it was followed by, everything's okay, but your mom's in the hospital or something like that. And I would say to him, Dad, you are just going to have to call me to talk about the weather so that I don't associate your phone calls with something terrible. And we would both laugh. And he used to watch the Weather Channel all the time, so he knew what the weather was like where I was. And then when my sister was in school up in Northern California, he would watch so he knew what the weather was like where she was too. So that was the other thing. My dad would always watch the Weather Channel. And if you go back to the episode Unexpected Family, I talk quite a bit about how my father never really talked about his family, except for when I moved to Los Angeles. It turned out we had a whole bleed-in side of our family I knew nothing about. And that's how I got to know my cousin Susie and her dad Joe, and a whole new chapter of life and family unfolded from that. So my dad was someone who just really kept a lot in. He wasn't someone who was going to pour out his life to you. But he really showed up with all his heart. So some other sweet memories of my dad. My dad also really loved food. We definitely had that in common. He was a bigger guy and he had to watch his weight, but my dad loved food. And we really connected on that. So whenever there was a family function, whether it was Passover or Thanksgiving or a birthday, somehow my dad would get jammed into the far end of the table where it would be hard to get in and out, and he would just sit there patiently. And then whenever the desserts were served, whoever was hosting, whether it was my mom or my aunt or my cousin, would go, "Anybody want another piece of cake? Anybody want another piece of pie?" And my dad would always say, "I wouldn't say no." That brings me such joy because I can hear him, "I wouldn't say no." And then he would always get another sliver of something. And my cousin Sherry always says one of her favorite memories, and I hope it's okay that I'm sharing this, Sherry. One of her favorite memories of my dad is how appreciative he always was whenever she hosted. And he always loved her coffee. And my dad had this beautiful appetite for family, for food, for a good cup of coffee, for his grandchildren, for his nieces and nephews, and his kids. So I feel like I need to now bridge this into my life with my husband, Wes, because I am absolutely positive that my father picked out Wes for me. My father had been gone a couple of years by the time I met Wes. So, my dad was a Pisces, Wes is a Pisces. And there are so many things about Wes that remind me in the best way possible of my dad. I remember we had just been together a couple of months, and I was still living in LA and Wes was living up here in the Bay Area. And I had to go to the doctor. I was on the phone with him, and he said, "What time do you need to go see the doc?" Now, I don't know how many people in your life refer to the doctor as the doc, but only one other person in my life ever used that phrase, and that was my dad. And when Wes said that, I just looked at the phone. I'm like, oh my God, that is such a Jack Bleadon thing to say. And then my dad, as an electrical engineer, he would get fluorescent light bulbs and stuff back in the day. And they're not, it's not an attractive form of light, but my dad was always kind of replacing light bulbs, and Wes does the same thing. When the halogen light bulbs showed up, Wes replaced everything to halogen, and then now everything is LED. And again, I'm like, this is such a Jack Bleadon thing. And when I get together with my cousins and stuff, we're all piling over each other in conversation. And Wes just kind of waits for his opening, which is a very Jack Bleadon thing to do. And so years ago, I went to a mediumship circle, and the medium's name is Felix Lee Lerma, Lerma, for anyone who wants to look him up. He's phenomenal. And each of us was going to get a reading. So it was a gallery style reading, but each one of us would get a reading. Now, what I have been taught about mediumship is usually the ones who come forward in a reading are the ones who are sort of the most gregarious and friendly in life. That personality travels over. It's not always easy for a medium to read someone who has been very quiet in life. So I remember the morning of this event, I said to my dad, I said, Dad, listen, I have spent $70 on this and I want to hear from you. So you push your way to the front. I do not want to hear from an aunt or a great grandparent. I want to hear from you. So get with it, Dad. I really want to hear from you. And so the medium was reading everybody, and I was one of, probably in the last third of people to be read. And he gets to me and he goes, all right, I'm getting Dad, J-A, Jack. And I'm like, yes, that's my dad's name. I was so excited. And the medium, he motions to his body and he says, your dad is saying, I'm thin now. I look great. Because my dad was always battling weight. And then the medium points to Wes and he says, your dad is saying, I love this guy. I love him. And I said, I know he does. And there were some other things that were very evidential that he was talking with my dad that were really beautiful. And so I just know that I have my dad's blessing with Wes. And the highest compliment my dad would pay to someone is he would say, you know what, that person, they are good people. Like you're good people. And so I just know my dad would have said about Wes, that Wes, he is good people. That would have been a very Jack Bleadon thing to say. My dad would say that about you. You are good people. And I guess I'll also share with you about how my dad felt about this evolution, the spiritual evolution I went on. So my dad passed away in 2003, so he only got to see the first 3 years of all of this. But it was really a blessing. So my dad was always worried about how sensitive I am. He worried that it would make life hard for me. And perhaps it did for a long time, but I could tell him now it's my superpower right now that I've grown into it. But I remember telling my parents that I was going to enroll in the University of Santa Monica to get a master's degree in spiritual psychology. Now, my dad was a pretty cynical guy. I once asked him why he was cynical, and he said, I suppose that's my way of never being disappointed in life. And I don't mean that he was dark. I just mean, my dad was an Ashkenazi Jew. He grew up very poor. His father died when he was 18. He fought in World War II. He lived through the Depression. You plan for the worst and hope it doesn't happen. That was sort of the philosophy for my dad. He didn't have this light, fluffy upbringing, right? Life was hard. So my dad voiced his concern that I was going to join a cult, that this was going to be a cult, and that I had to be alert to make sure I was not going to fall into some sort of, trap. And I remember saying to my dad, Dad, if I was that easily influenced, I would have never moved to Los Angeles, and I would live in Northbrook right now, and I would be married to a doctor or a lawyer, because that's what I was supposed to do. And my dad said, touche. Okay. And I did add, but if they ask me to put on saffron robes and troll the airport for donations, I will think twice. So what was so beautiful was how earlier in the episode I shared with you how so much changed for me because of my experience at USM. Well, my father witnessed it. And in the second year at USM, they invite us to do a nurturing project. And we're going to spend 9 months nurturing someone in our life and see what happens. But they can't know we're nurturing them. So I picked my dad. At this point, my dad had developed Parkinson's. So before, my dad wasn't a big talker, and now he had Parkinson's, and so it made it even more difficult for him. And I decided I'm going to nurture my dad and see what happens. My big heart relationship was always with my mom. She was the one I talked to. She was the one I confided in. And then everything got relayed to my father. So I was going to build a direct relationship with my dad that I really hadn't had since I was a little girl. So I started emailing him. I would ask him questions. I would share with him about my life and what I was doing and the experiences that I was having. And he would write me back. And I would pick up the phone and I would say, Mom, can I talk to Dad for a few minutes? And I would talk to my dad. And when I would go back to visit them, I would make a date with my dad. I'd be like, Dad, I'm coming into town. Can you and I go have coffee? And then we would have our own special date. And it was the sweetest thing. I really got to learn more about my dad, and he got to learn more about me. One of the things that to this day makes me giggle is I love deep conversation, which I'm sure does not surprise you. And sometimes in my conversation with my dad, we would go into the deep end of the ocean. And my dad would abruptly disconnect the conversation. So we might be talking on the phone about something. And then he would just all of a sudden go, okay, here's your mother. And I'd be like, okay, you were done, huh? He's like, yeah. I was like, okay, Dad, no problem. And one of the things that he had become very interested in was in Jewish mysticism. So while I was getting my degree in spiritual psychology, he was studying Jewish mysticism. So we would have these really interesting conversations. And sometimes they would happen through email. And what was so beautiful is that when I graduated, he was still alive. And they were not able to come out for the graduation. But my dad sent me this beautiful email telling me that he was proud of me and that he had been wrong about the program. He could see that I had blossomed and I had found purpose and meaning in my life. And that was all he ever wanted for me. And so in his email, he said, I was wrong. This has been wonderful for you, and I'm so happy for you, and I'm proud of you. So I'm so grateful that my experience at USM opened the door and invited me into making space for a deeper relationship with my father. So my dad had Parkinson's. And I promise this conversation is not going to be dark and depressing, where we're going to go from here. And it's a difficult disease. I don't know if you have anyone in your life who has Parkinson's, or if perhaps you do. But one of the things that I do to pay tribute to my dad is I am participating in a multi-year Parkinson's study through the Michael J. Fox Association. It's called PPMI, which stands for Parkinson's Progressions Markers Initiative. And it is a very unique study. They have 1,000 people or so enrolled, and I go on site once a year for a lot of different tests. They do cognitive testing, blood work, DAT scans, MRIs, lumbar punctures, and they're building up this database of different biomarkers to begin to track who gets Parkinson's, when does it show up, are there biomarkers that identify the progression of it, and it's really a remarkable study. And I've been in the study for 5 years now, And it is so profoundly rewarding. So, how it works, if any of you are interested in participating, this is my little public service announcement. If someone in your immediate genetic family has had Parkinson's, you can apply to participate. And they will offer to do genetic testing. There are 2 genetic mutations right now that they are studying that seem to contribute for some forms of Parkinson's. And they're also taking people who do not have these genetic markers. And then you go in once a year on site, and then also once a year you have a Zoom conversation, an appointment perhaps we'll call it. And I love getting to participate in this because you must know, if you listen to this podcast or if we know each other, that a huge part of my mission in my life is to contribute in a positive way. To know that somehow my life has made a difference. And participating in this study, it's interesting. I have always battled having a body. I know that sounds strange. I have not been great friends with my body for much of my life. And I love that I now get to invite this body of mine to participate in a study that perhaps one day will help the researchers figure out how to prevent Parkinson's, cure Parkinson's, treat Parkinson's. At this point, we don't know what is going to come about. At this point, there have already been some really exciting developments that have come from this study. So the other way you can participate is if you're over the age of 60, they are inviting you to take a smell test. It's super easy. You just fill out the form. You go over to the Michael J. Fox Foundation and look at the smell test button that they have, and they will mail you an at-home smell test. And sometimes, not always, a shift in smell can be an indicator, an early indicator, I should say, of Parkinson's. But if you are losing your smell, don't worry about it. It doesn't mean that this is what's happening. But what they're seeking to do is to build as big a database as possible of people over 60 who are taking this test, so that they can then cultivate a subset to follow. So even if no one in your family has Parkinson's, even if you've lost your smell because of COVID, or if your smell is fantastic, wherever you are on the smell continuum of life, post 60 years old, PPMI and the Michael J. Fox Foundation are inviting you to take this smell test. And then you too will have the joy of knowing that you are contributing to the greater good, simply by taking this super easy test. And it's a fascinating test. It's a scratch and sniff test that I found really interesting. So it's one of the ways that I honor my dad. And thank you so much for letting me share him with you. He was a good guy. I'm so blessed. I had a really, really good dad. It's really something to be in the world as a little girl who had a wonderful father, right? It has allowed me to grow up with a really solid foundation in who I am and my place in the world. And so my dad would say about you, you are good people. And he would tell me not to worry so much or not to feel so deeply. And I would say, Dad, it's my superpower. I'm really good at this. And he would be really proud of me for making this podcast and sharing the love. He would probably listen to it. Maybe he'd give me a little critique here and there. But I'm so glad I get to share him with you. So thank you so much for allowing me to share this very beautiful, sacred part of my tapestry of life. I'm going to put the link to the PPMI study in the show notes. So if any of you are interested, you can go ahead and check it out. And if you have any questions about the study I was sharing with you about, feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to share with you about my experience. It's absolutely wonderful. And in case any of you are worriers, at this moment in my life, I am healthy. I have no signs of Parkinson's. And God willing, that will be my truth the rest of my life. So I figured I should put that in there just in case any of you were worried for me. And don't worry for me, I'm good. Like whatever happens in life, I'll be good. Life is good. And so you rest well. This is the longest rambling completion of an episode I think I have done yet. So thanks for bearing with me. I love you. Sweet dreams. And we'll talk again soon. Thank you. You're awesome. And you're good people.